From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lyons, I'm Joe Matthew.
President Biden meets with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House, just a day after addressing the American people from the Oval Office to explain his decision to drop out of the race.
We're joined today by Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Chicago on the changing of the guard in his party and the Democratic convention about to take place in his city.
And we'll talk with Hagar Chemali, CEO of Greenwich Media Strategies, about Netanyahu's meetings with Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and Donald Trump, and the chances of a ceasefire in Gaza. So obviously it's been another busy day in Washington as we've seen a succession of meetings now with the Israeli prime minister and leaders. First, he met with Biden. They met together with hostage families as well at the White House. And now it's the vice president's turn after she decided not to preside over his address to a joint session of Congress yesterday, although they say it's because she had a pre-scheduled event. That's
correct, but another fly-on-the-wall moment, I suspect. They did let the pool, I should say, into the room in the Oval Office, the press pool, for a little bit of a sense of what they were talking about. I don't think that'll be the case when Netanyahu goes to Mar-a-Lago tomorrow. But we have to remember that in that Oval Office, it was only hours earlier that the president addressed the American people on his decision to drop out of the race.
Yep, talking about preservation of democracy, how he needed to pass the torch, and of course, that torch being passed to his vice president, Kamala Harris, who he endorsed again in that speech last night. And she's been on the campaign trail herself before she meets with Netanyahu this afternoon. She was actually in Texas addressing a number of union workers, the American Federation of Teachers, and she also was asked by the press pool about whether or not she's planning to debate Donald Trump.
Many of you have been asking me about the debate, and I'll tell you, I'm ready to debate Donald Trump. I have agreed to the previously agreed upon September 10th debate. He agreed to that previously. Now it appears he's backpedaling, but I'm ready. And I think the voters deserve to see the split screen that exists in this race on a debate stage. And so I'm ready. Let's go.
Ready? Let's go. With Bloomberg White House editor Michelle Jamrisko at the table. Michelle, it's great to see you. Are we to believe this will really happen? To Kamala Harris's point, Donald Trump was suggesting that he might not want to use this venue or the moderator that was already agreed to here.
That's right. It's been a real tango, Joe, both at the presidential level and the VP level on deciding how this debate will come together and if it will come together and who will host it. But as you heard from Kamala right there, they've been eager to kind of lock this in. I'm just thinking back today to a few weeks ago before the Biden dropout when she was angling for the VP debate. And she was pressuring the Vance team and others to kind of lock in that date. And their response, kind of snide but clever, was, well, we'll let you know when we decide, when we hear who your VP is, because they were already kind of pushing this line that Biden will eventually drop out and Kamala will be the nominee, which, in fact, here we are. But it kind of takes both of them by, a little bit of surprise, and they both have to kind of make these pivots. So that is among the things up in the air. I understand the Trump campaign is pushing for a Fox-hosted debate. We'll see if those terms are agreed upon or if they can find some middle ground there.
Of course, when the visit by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the U.S. was scheduled, we, too, thought he would be meeting with someone who was still leading the Democratic ticket in President Biden. Instead, he's meeting separately with the vice president after meeting with Biden earlier today. What do we know about what came out of that meeting? Knowing Joe Biden in his speech last night said one of the things he wants to accomplish with his remaining time in office is a ceasefire in Gaza.
Well, we don't know much with 100% certainty because they don't want to, per usual, read out the specifics, especially of the ceasefire deal. They've been very kind of more in general terms about what's agreed upon, what they're trying to get Israel to kind of step over the line and say, yes, the ceasefire framework works. But the details are not being revealed. We heard from the families of hostages who met with both Netanyahu and Biden also after that Oval Office meeting, saying, we heard some things that we can't relate to you on the details. However, we share the optimism that we're closer than we have been before. So we don't know much about the substance there. But what we do know is that Biden continues to kind of emphasize I've had this long history of pro-Israel stance. I've known Netanyahu for, some 40 years or decades. I've been involved with every prime minister back to Golda Meir. So you hear that kind of language, even as he's now dropped out, and his successor doesn't have that sort of experience and has a bit of a different angle on pressuring the Israeli government on this issue. So if there's any daylight on foreign policy between Biden and Harris, there is some on this issue. So it's a very complicated day because, she's presidential nominee likely for her party, but she's also still the vice president. So there's 3 different meetings going on here that could, just yield very different results.
Yep. Mar-a-Lago tomorrow with Donald Trump. Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko, thank you so much. Now, today, former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other House Democrats said Vice President Kamala Harris can win against Trump in November.
It's all over, what's your name? It's all over. That's not how Washington should run. And under Kamala Harris, people's voices will be heard in a very different way than you're trading at the table with big oil, big pharma, big guns, big money. It's about the people.
This is the House voted to condemn Harris for the White House policy on combating illegal immigration, her role as the quote-unquote border czar, with 6 Democrats joining that Republican-led effort. For more, let's bring in Jack Fitzpatrick of Bloomberg Government. So, Jack, considering we just heard President Biden last night say he stepped down from the race in order to bring his party, unite his party together, 6 Democrats condemning the now presumptive Democratic nominee doesn't seem like a huge show of unity.
It's not unanimous unity, but it's sort of the exception to the rule so far for Kamala Harris. You look big picture, the fundraising numbers are good for her. The endorsements that have come in are good for her. 6 members who march to the beat of their own drummer. When Republicans bring fairly partisan things to the floor, you can count that maybe Jared Golden or Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez or potentially Henry Cuellar, these kinds of members are going to vote for a Republican initiative. They say the House of Representatives managing it is like herding cats. You can't get everybody on board. And so these are some 6 notable members, especially if the elections go well for Democrats. If they end up with a narrow majority in the House, these are names to watch for people who are not under the thumb of leadership. It could be a thorn in the side of a potential Harris administration. And 6 isn't a huge number, but they are notable people going against the grain.
We should note at the same time there was a direction from the Speaker of the House for members to cool the rhetoric here. Republican members, when it comes to Kamala Harris, having been described by several members as a DEI hire. They'll have some time to think about this, though, Jack, because everyone's leaving, which makes it pretty difficult to get anything done. You specialize in appropriations. There'll be no appropriating till September when we're talking about a shutdown?
Yeah, there's not going to be much happening until the lame duck session, really. They have to do a stopgap measure to get past the September 30th deadline to avoid a shutdown, but no one has any expectation of making progress on key legislation to fund the government, to get ahead of the debt limit deadline that nominally is January 1st so they can bump it back a bit. The question is, when you bump this stuff back to a likely lame duck deadline, if Trump wins, does he want to get it off the plate and direct congressional Republicans to negotiate and allow him to focus on getting cabinet officials in? Or does he say, actually, I want a deadline, if he wins, I want a deadline early in my administration to pick a fight. Republicans have said it's up to him if he wins to decide the timing of a shutdown and debt limit showdown, whether he says, get it done before I'm in the lame duck, or give me the fight. And that's going to be an interesting decision for him to make that Republicans have said they'll go along with.
Think of how much we have to look forward to. Jack Fitzpatrick from Bloomberg Government, thank you so much for the insights. Elsewhere today, another important story, U.S. economic growth accelerating by more than forecast in the second quarter. GDP day today. White House Council of Economic Advisors Chair Jared Bernstein talked with us earlier following the data.
We have some very nice momentum, a kind of a perpetual motion forward kind of story with strong labor market, easing prices, real wage gains, real incomes rising, feeding into good consumer spending. That in turn helps to get investors back into the act. And I do think that is very much the characteristic of a steady, solid, ongoing recovery.
Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle joins us now with a look at what was a volatile day in the end in the markets. Abigail, this was a pretty positive reaction. What was with the reversal at the end of the day?
Lots of volatility on the day, Joe, and it's interesting because there was positive information there. Initially, stocks were down, then they were higher, and then ultimately closed lower. On the day, the S&P 500 down about 0.5%, the tech-heavy NASDAQ down more. So all of this means that over the last 5 days, we have this S&P 500 down nearly 3%, down 2.6%. But I'd really like to hone in on the VIX, because while there's a lot of rhetoric that the reason we've got this volatility is big tech too far, too fast, yes, that is a piece of it. I would argue that it continues to be uncertainty around election 2024. We certainly don't know who is going to be in the White House in 2025 or who is going to win in November. And we still have the Democratic National Convention ahead in Chicago. When we break it down on the day, though, it's interesting. It does appear that the Trump trade is returning. RTX, the defense company, up in a big way, the best day since 2020. They put up a great quarter. The outlook was good. But we can certainly put that in the bucket of stocks that would be associated with Donald Trump. In addition, DJT higher. On the other hand, tech lower. That's the Vance trade. He's a little bit anti-big tech. So we have that tech slide. That is, though, of course, that too far, too fast. Let's put this all together with some of the predicted odds, the betting odds. I know that the polls are super tight between Kamala Harris, VP Harris, and Donald Trump. These predicted odds have been extremely, extremely accurate, though. And right now, narrow, 12%, much narrower than it had been, but a slight widening. It just reflects all the uncertainty that we have around election 2024, Kelly.
All right, Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much. Now, still ahead on Balance of Power, Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois will join us next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
For the next 6 months, I'll be focused on doing my job as president. That means I'll continue to lower costs for hardworking families, grow our economy. I'll keep calling out hate and extremism. Make it clear there is no place in America for political violence or any violence ever, period. I'm going to keep speaking out to protect our kids from gun violence. Our planet from climate crisis is the existential threat.
President Biden last night outlining some of his priorities for the rest of his time as president in an Oval Office address. For more on that now, we're joining us here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio live from Capitol Hill is Democratic Congressman Sean Casten of Illinois. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. Obviously, the president outlining some pretty ambitious things he would like to see done in his speech last night. A lot of things, though, do require Congress to get done. And considering that most of your colleagues have now jetted out of Washington not to return until mid-September, are you confident that this administration is going to be able to do much more legislatively?
Well, look, unfortunately, legislatively, this has been arguably the least productive Congress ever. And the irony is that the majorities that the Republicans have is about the same as the majorities we had last term when we had one of the most productive Congresses ever. Infrastructure bills, biggest climate bill ever, the PACT Act to help our veterans. And it's really sort of the Republican Party is at war with itself, and they're not going to resolve that soon. Now, to the Biden point, I mean, he wants to play a leading role in figuring out how to address the crisis in Gaza. That doesn't take legislation. That takes American leadership and an American leader who is committed to standing up for the post-World War II order, which Biden has dedicated his life to. Obviously, there's a stark contrast with someone else who, Russia just endorsed J.D. Vance. And so I'm just nothing but impressed with the way that Joe Biden has comported himself from this, dedicated himself to those causes that can be done by the executive branch, and then, passed the torch on to Kamala Harris, which I think we're all very excited about.
I hate to ask the dumb questions, Congressman, but sometimes that's what I'm here for. You're talking to us for our viewers on Bloomberg TV from an empty rotunda. Everyone's leaving. Why is this happening? Where's everyone going?
Well, so the congressional calendar, which is set by the majority, had us that we were supposed to be in Washington this week and next week. This week on the floor, we had an appropriations bill, and I was talking with some of my colleagues who were voting on amendments, and then all of a sudden, We said, why are there no more votes coming up? And a couple of my colleagues came on and they said, are we going home? And then we looked down and Mike Johnson's arguing and they didn't have the votes. And, I found myself talking with Catherine Clark, our whip, and saying, as the whip, do you count votes before you bring a bill to the floor or after you decide not to pass it on the floor, that they didn't have the votes? And it's, there's a Schadenfreude there, I suppose, but this is not how government's supposed to work. Like we have to fund the government by September 30th, and we go into Congress, they don't have the votes on the floor, and then they say, well, just go home, take an extra week off because they don't have work. Now, we don't take off, we'll go home and, meet with our constituents. But unfortunately, they've sent us packing.
Well, Congressman, something did pass on the floor of the House today. It was a resolution condemning Vice President Harris for her role as the border czar in the Biden administration. 6 of your Democratic colleagues voted for that, considering President Biden last night essentially said that he stepped down in the name of party unity. What do you tell those colleagues tonight?
As you'd said in your prior piece, these are some members who are in some very vulnerable districts who are thinking a lot about their own reelection. And I think if you ask any of them individually, what they will all tell you is that that bill is never going to be taken up by the Senate. It is completely non-binding. And their judgment, I think, I'm not, I don't want to tell you how they're thinking, but I think their judgment was that this helps me hold my seat and it doesn't really matter. I think the sadder one for folks like me is that that's not what we should have been voting on this week. That wasn't something that any of the Republicans were talking about until they realized that they had a formidable candidate for president and they couldn't pass a funding bill. So maybe we'll just do something that says Kamala Harris mean not happy. Okay, fine, but it's a substanceless bill, and we'll move on now to get to the real work.
Well, in a few weeks, Congressman, we're all going to be converging on your hometown of Chicago for the Democratic National Convention. I don't know if Kamala Harris is going to be made the nominee officially in Chicago or if it will be done virtually ahead of time. Maybe you have some insights into that, but I wonder if this change at the top of the ticket makes you less concerned about security. The whole story so far about Chicago is 1968, the protests, where do we draw the perimeter? Does that change now that it's Kamala Harris?
I couldn't tell you what how the Secret Service and everybody else is thinking about this, other than that in the briefings that I've had with them, they are going to make absolutely sure that we have a safe convention, as they did in Milwaukee and, and at the NATO summit, these high-profile events that go through. I think what's really sort of much more exciting, we were talking to folks today that if you're 35 or younger, you didn't vote in 2008, which means that every election you voted in has been this tremendous fear about what the future of our country is. The voting after January 6th, the voting in COVID, the voting when, all the horrible things that Trump was saying about Hillary Clinton. And you just have this amazing energy now, especially among young people, who are saying, this is someone who I'm really excited about. This is someone who smiles, who dances, who looks like me. This is the opportunity for us to say on our 250th anniversary in 2046 that for the first time in our history, we have a woman in the White House and a woman of color. And isn't that like a positive thing? And I just think there's just such an enthusiasm, yes, among Democrats, but I think in America of someone who stands for what we hope to be. Right? What we like to tell ourselves that we are, and that's pretty great.
Well, sir, you're describing the woman who is understood to be at the top of the ticket. Someone has to join her on it. Would you advocate for your governor to be her vice presidential pick?
I'm going to leave that decision up to who the Harris team thinks is the best pick to round that out. All of the people that have been suggested are great people. I know and have worked with some of them, not all of them, but I'll defer to them on that. I'm not going to put my thumb on that scale.
Just think what it would mean for O'Hare if it was your governor, Congressman. Thank you for being with us. We're going to meet you in Chicago, I hope. We'll be there in just, 3 weeks away now, 4 weeks to the DNC of Illinois. Of course, the south side of Chicago, Sean Casten, thank you. Still ahead on Bloomberg, we'll talk with Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the White House today. Hagar Chemali, Greenwich Media Strategist, will join us here to talk about the meeting today and the potential fallout. This is coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
So I won't speculate about what's going to happen in November. I do think we see enormous bipartisan agreement that we need to reinvigorate and double down on antitrust enforcement. We need to make sure that monopolies can't illegally use their power to jack up prices for consumers, to really undermine workers, or really stamp out entrepreneurs and small businesses. And so that bipartisan agreement around the importance of open, fair competition to protect our free and fair enterprise system is absolutely critical.
FTC Chair Lina Khan speaking earlier here on Bloomberg TV and radio in a fascinating conversation that we brought you on the early edition of Balance of Power. Emily Chang was holding forth with the commissioner in an interesting moment for Lina Khan here. And antitrust with so many questions, Kaylee, about what a Trump 2.0 would mean, knowing that J.D. Vance, as we discussed in Milwaukee, strange bedfellows here, I guess, is a big fan of her and her style when it comes to big tech specifically.
Yeah, he suggested that Lina Khan is one of the people doing the only real good job he's seen within this administration. He does seem to be an advocate for more antitrust effort, more pro-competition, perhaps, which, of course, has been a characteristic of the Biden administration, focusing heavily on competition, on cracking down on big mergers and acquisitions. So the question becomes, if we're comparing what the likelihood of a more pro-competitive environment may look like under these administrations, would they really be that different? Of course, on the one hand, we're talking about Kamala Harris, who would be a president potentially, versus J.D. Vance at vice president. A lot of these decisions may be left up to Donald Trump.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, and a lot of the political friendships that J.D. Vance has made in the last couple of years here in Washington may not last past Inauguration Day if they were to win. You know, he was teaming up with Elizabeth Warren on issues like these, and I can't imagine Lina Khan working in a Trump administration, because Donald Trump in the end will set the policy. But it is an interesting moment where you see the two political sides maybe giving up a little bit of ground on this issue of antitrust.
Yeah, and of course, we see some overlap in other issues as well. We think of both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance as being populist and protectionist, advocating for tariffs, maybe to a larger degree than we've seen during this administration, but you still see tariffs on the Democratic side as well.
Democrats are the free enterprise party now. It's a funny time. Joe Biden likes to call it an inflection point. He did that again in the Oval Office address last evening, and you can kind of interpret that as you want, but it's hard to deny in a case like this.
Certainly. And on the subject of Biden's Oval Office address, he made clear in that address one of the things he still wants to see accomplished while he's in office is an end to the war in Gaza. So on that note, we'll turn back to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's visit to the White House this afternoon. We'll be joined by Hagar Chemali, Greenwich Media Strategies founder and CEO, and former director for Syria and Lebanon at the National Security Council. Next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Mr. President, we've known each other for 40 years, and you've known every Israeli Prime Minister for 50 years, from Golda Meir. So from a proud Jewish Zionist to a proud Irish-American Zionist, I want to thank you for 50 years of public service and 50 years of support for the State of Israel.
Oh, by the way, that first meeting with Prime Minister Golda Meir, she had an assistant sitting next to me, a guy named Rabin, and so far back it goes. I was only 12 then.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu meeting with President Joe Biden in the Oval Office today. Biden there joking about his meeting not as a 12-year-old, but as a 30-year-old senator with Golda Meir and future Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. That was in 1973. Fast forward to today, we're joined by Hagar Chemali, Greenwich Media Strategies founder and CEO, former director for Syria and Lebanon and the National Security Council. Hagar, it's great to see you and welcome back. I wonder your thoughts as you look at these two world leaders today in the same room, knowing how much difficulty they've experienced in their relationship since October 7th. Joe Biden made it pretty clear last night in his address to the nation that a ceasefire in Gaza is his priority. That's the number one thing he wants to accomplish by the time he leaves office. Will this meeting today help?
Yeah, he had a tall order in his final speech, President Biden, about the list of accomplishments he'd like to achieve in those last 6 months. I certainly hope he achieves all of them, including an end to the war. And I do think that we're going to reach some kind of end. That doesn't mean, of course, that you're not going to see probably additional raids or efforts to target and kill Hamas leaders, but some kind of end to the intense violence and strikes that we are continuing to see. And there has been, and I have said this now over the last month, this building pressure to reach that end. And apparently Netanyahu and Biden spoke about it today, how to reach that end. And it's the same deal that's on the table, the three-phase proposal that the Biden administration has proposed, and the pressure all around to get to agree to that deal and to agree to the details of that deal is growing. So I do think that the meeting today certainly helped. I will say that as controversial as Netanyahu's visit to Washington has been and his address to Congress, I will say it is poignant for other reasons to see the way he talks about President Biden and Biden's 40 years of friendship to Israel. That is very true. That has been a key feature of Biden's policies, and he has always felt strongly about Israel. And I think that Netanyahu was right in not playing on political divisions while he's here, at least not yet, and really expressing gratitude to the president in his address yesterday and today in his meeting.
Yeah, of course, he did express gratitude for Donald Trump as well. In his address, he's going to be heading to Mar-a-Lago tomorrow to meet with the former president, Hagar. But just to focus on the role of President Biden a moment longer, they, of course, after their Oval Office meeting, met with families of hostages. And they were asked, those families, during a meeting with the press, if Biden dropping out of the race affected a hostage deal. One of them said, I actually think it allows the president to be laser focused on the things that are true priorities for him. They went on to suggest not worrying about all the things surrounding a re-election allows him to focus on this. What do you think about the fact that we now know Joe Biden is going to be a one-term president? He is out of there in January of 2025. How does that change the character of this entire thing?
Well, you know, it's true. I mean, I was there for the second term, both under President Bush and President Obama. And often at the end of a term of any president, when they know that it's the end, they'll often look to achieve a number of big goals that they feel they can just push through. And so I do expect President Biden actually to have this kind of renewed effort to achieve a lot of the goals that he had on his list. Like I said, it was a tall order: curing cancer, ending climate change, making more progress on gun control. However, he does have, obviously, he's the president of the United States. There's a lot of power there. And if he's not worried about an election, then there's a lot there that he can go and pursue. And I think that Vice President Harris has separated herself already enough where I think he can pursue these efforts without worrying that she's going to get blamed for. I mean, the Republicans will try that, but I do think that the cheese stands alone in this case. But I will say, so I do think that it'll be interesting for that for those reasons. I do have to say on the hostage point, because I want to highlight that a lot of people have been frustrated. Hostage families, a lot of Americans in general, Jewish Americans, have been frustrated at the lack of priority, at what they deem a lack of priority from the Biden administration on the hostages, particularly the American hostages. There are still American hostages being held in Gaza, and unlike other hostages or wrongfully detained individuals you hear about around the world, we have not heard a lot, at least not forcefully and repeatedly, about the American hostages. And so I do hope that we're going to see more of that in the coming months.
Hagar, does Netanyahu threaten to undo any progress done today when he visits Mar-a-Lago tomorrow?
I don't think so. If anything, I think that the meeting, the address to Congress, is what could have undone a lot of progress. And we don't have exactly a good track record with Netanyahu addressing Congress back in 2015 when I was in the U.S. government, and Speaker Boehner invited him to speak to address Congress behind President Obama's back to speak about the nuclear deal, and that was not looked upon very favorably. I understand this time it was a bit different, but still controversial nonetheless. And Vice President Harris didn't even preside over the talk, right? So you could have had that, and he could have used that opportunity, and I expected him to try and play more on the divisions and stress to Congress that he needed their help over the president's, which he tried to do in a video only a few weeks ago, where he went out and tried to blame the Biden administration for weapons shipments holdups and a holdup of weapons shipments and so on. And he didn't play into any of that. He made it more of a stump speech. I'm not trying to say that it was a great speech at all, but he didn't go into that. So I don't expect much that would be controversial out of the Trump meeting. I expect the typical. I expect him to have a PR show, to have a photo op, to play it up. But I do think he'll be careful, especially given how much more tight the election seems to be now. I think he'll be much more careful to come off as though he's endorsing Trump, given that you now have Vice President Harris in the race and polls are showing a much tighter one.
Well, as we think about what Netanyahu said yesterday, Hagar, he also talked about the idea that Israel is standing in the way of Iran in the Middle East, and it's Israel that's making sure that U.S. troops don't have to be put on the ground. He talked about how Israel will essentially go after anyone that threatens it, and that includes, as he referenced, Hezbollah and the border to the north. Part of what President Biden said yesterday was not just that he wants to see an end to the war in Gaza, but peace and security in the Middle East. Maybe he could get the one. Can he get the other?
Yes, I think, again, God bless him for trying to get peace in the Middle East. I think every U.S. president has dreamt of that, because that would surely secure an amazing legacy. I think that even with just reaching a ceasefire would be still an amazing legacy, to be honest with you. But I think that's too tall of an order. But you harp on a very good point, because Bibi, in his address to Congress, tried to make this point to everybody that basically Israel's fight is the U.S. fight, and whatever Israel is doing is also on behalf of the United States, not just on behalf of Israel. And he's harping on this at a time when we do have significant threats that we're seeing from Iran, and they're not just toward Israel, they're toward U.S. presence as well. And we are seeing, and this is something that I think that is really should not go unmentioned. When you saw that Houthi strike that happened a week ago, where a drone went and exploded over a building in Tel Aviv, killing one Israeli citizen, that drone came in. It was surveilled, apparently, but a, quote, human error is what prevented it from being shot down. And the Israeli military is still investigating that. But I want to highlight that as a former counterterrorism person and how big of a deal that is to have a terrorist group and militants who are thousands of miles away send a drone and have it be able to reach the capital and cause any kind of damage. It is a very different world of warfare when fighting terrorist groups. And so I think it's impossible to reach peace across the Middle East, but I do think that Netanyahu is right in saying that he needs to focus on all of them, and that it impacts the United States' national security as well.
All right, Hagar Chemali of Greenwich Media Strategies, always good to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. And still ahead, our political panel will be with us. We'll have their reaction to Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit and meeting with President Biden, and with Harris, and with Trump. We'll also discuss Biden's address to the nation last night, and more on what it means for the rest of his presidency. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think Biden is, as he has said, a Zionist, someone who feels very deeply connected to the state of Israel, but increasingly frustrated with Netanyahu. I think Harris is going to be coming at this from a slightly different place. I think she's a bit more pragmatic. I think she's a little bit less emotionally attached to this conflict, but ultimately she's going to continue to toe the line of this administration as vice president. And the only time that could change is if she's elected president.
That was Carmel Arbit, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, speaking with us earlier today about how Vice President Harris could differentiate herself from President Biden on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Of course, in a spotlight today is Netanyahu meets with both of them at the White House. Let's bring in our political panel. Brittany Martinez, Republican strategist and founder of Espina & Co., and Alvin Jordan, our Democratic strategist this evening. So welcome to both of you. Obviously, Biden was up first with Netanyahu. Harris is meeting with him, I believe, as we speak. But when it comes to the president, knowing it was just last night that he was outlining what he still wants to achieve with his remaining time in office, what he wants his legacy to be. Part of that was an end to the war in Gaza. Do you expect that this relationship with Israel, with Netanyahu, is going to be the primary focus of his remaining months in the White House?
Yeah, I think so. I think he made that clear last night as far as, the points that he would try to cover on his way out. I think it would also go a long way in kind of putting a nice bow, so to speak, on the legacy that is President Biden. So much has been made of that. And so I think as far as what he can actually do in the time in which he has left, I definitely think from a priority standpoint, this has to be at the top of the list.
Interesting to see and hear from Joe Biden last evening, first time since COVID, and a lot of things have happened. We got the letterhead on Sunday, so it was somewhat anticlimactic when it came to the message. He only spoke for 10 minutes, 11 minutes to the American people. Would it have been worth a couple of more to explain why he was leaving the presidential race, to acknowledge the issue at hand?
I don't think that the American people necessarily needed it, in the sense that if you look at just the momentum that has kind of quickly come together to, I think, support and prop up the vice president to make a run, I think if we, kind of saw the opposite as far as a slow build or a slow take to her being the nominee, then maybe we do get a bit more explanation and a bit more of the president's time in that regard. But I think the fact that the base has kind of come together so quickly and the support has risen pretty quickly that, he just, I think as a formality, needed to do it, but I don't think that he necessarily needed to be heavy-handed with it.
Well, and certainly he was not. He was instead focused on all these things that he wants to do, whether it was climate change, Supreme Court reform. He mentioned Brittany. The fact of the matter remains, there's only so much he can do from that office. He needs Congress for a lot. And Congress, or at least the House, just got out of town for a month and a half. They're not back until September 9th. You know quite well the lack of functioning of this Congress in particular, having worked for former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Is there any room for any further legislative accomplishments for President Biden?
No, I really don't think so. And I don't mean that as a testament to him and his political acumen or legislative acumen, but it's an election year. It's a general election year. And this is a home stretch where, 3.5 months out, there's very little that's going to get done. And even on a midterm year, too, I mean, at this point in the race, like you said, the House is out. I don't know if the Senate is officially out, but they're about to be if they're not.
They smell the fumes.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so, you need both of them to be in session to be able to move the needle any sort of way. So unfortunately, I don't think too much is going to get done, but it's wishful thinking, and it's good to be optimistic. I think we need that in our political lives these days.
I want to just go back to the address last evening. Joe Biden, talking to the nation here, had this to say. Well, let's listen to what he said about his decision to no longer.
My record as president, my leadership in the world, my vision for America's future, all merited a second term, but nothing can come in the way of saving our democracy. That includes personal ambition. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation.
Brittany, there are many Republicans, including J.D. Vance, who say if you cannot, and I believe the Speaker of the House said this too, if you can't run for re-election, you can't be president. What do you think?
I think it makes absolutely no sense. Why do you want to be running against an incumbent President Kamala Harris? It's easier to beat someone who isn't an incumbent, even though she is the current vice president. I'm not sure why they would be putting that out there.
So forced error politically.
For major forced error.
For the better of the nation?
For the better of, sure. For the better of the nation, it's so tough watching that speech, and I really feel for Biden because he's been a public servant for over 50 years, right? And it makes me feel a little bit like the Dianne Feinstein situation that we experienced last year. He's stepping down, she did not. So perhaps for the better of the nation, sure, but when we're talking about, politically, what Republicans have been saying, I don't think it is the smartest messaging. And I think it just puts us into political territory where we're making everything, I know it's politics literally, but we're making everything about politics, right? And in reality, I think the only person on the Republican side that I saw give a classy message about Biden was Mitt Romney. I'm like, that's, what we should be saying. I think if Republicans are looking up for messaging on this, they should look to him.
A different generation of politics.
Don't say.
We're going to have a lot more with our panel coming up as we turn to the Harris campaign, now releasing its first full digital ad with some help from Beyonce.
There are some people who think we should be a country of chaos, of fear, of hate. But us, we choose something different. We choose freedom.
We'll play it to the panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Now we have a new victim to defeat. Lion Kamala Harris. Lion, L-Y-I-N. 3.5 years, Lion Kamala Harris has been the ultra-liberal driving force behind every single Biden catastrophe. Kamala Harris is the most liberal elected politician in American history. As borders are, Kamala threw open our borders. Everything Kamala touches turns into a total disaster. Kamala, you're fired.
That's Donald Trump, of course, at a campaign rally last night in North Carolina, talking about Kamala Harris. As we reassemble our political panel, Brittany Martinez, Republican strategist, founder of Espina and Company, with us alongside Alvin Jordan, Democratic strategist. Great to have you both here. More hits where those came from, Alvin. Donald Trump said that Harris wants to be president, this is a quote, for savage criminals, illegal aliens. I will be the president for law-abiding Americans. It's interesting because the Harris campaign is framing this as the exact opposite, the prosecutor versus the convicted felon. So what's up is down, what's black is white.
I mean, that's I'm even in hearing it, I'm just, just laughing, thinking about it. I'm like, we've got the convicted felon versus the former attorney general. It couldn't be, at different ends of the spectrum so clearly. And so it's one of those things where.
Is the voter smart enough to tell?
I think, the base, even in looking at, I think in Wisconsin, some of the voters kind of just giving their point of view on the candidates as it speaks. And so saying that or bringing that up to say, I think the base is the base. But I think the voters that are looking and listening a bit more acutely, we've talked so much about those on the fringe. I do think that they're smart enough and will kind of start to make those distinctions, especially as we hear more from both candidates, of course, debates down the line and things of that nature. But it is kind of comical to hear on the front end just kind of the positions that both are taking given both past and present histories.
Yeah, well, of course, we're starting to get some early reads on voter sentiment about a head-to-head matchup between these two. Emerson did a poll of 5 swing states. Trump is leading Harris, but Harris is performing better than Biden was in the last reading. Same goes for the New York Times Siena poll that came out this afternoon. 1 point divides them nationally among likely voters. 48% for Trump, 47% for Harris. So if Donald Trump wants to expand those margins again, is mispronouncing her name and calling her Lion Kamala the way to do it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is sort of the same problem that we've been experiencing throughout this election cycle, right? Like back when Nikki Haley was in, her line was whoever puts in someone who's not the 80-year-old candidate, they're the ones who are going to win. And what we immediately saw was that, the vice president was able to have an incredible fundraising, 24 hours, broke all the records, that 44,000 women who were on that call with her. So there is a lot of enthusiasm, and I'm sure it's too early, like all this polling. I'm sure we'll continue to see a gap and perhaps a growth for the vice president. But I think that is no way to win over voters. It's giving vinegar and not honey. And I think it's a disservice to Republicans. We always say we want to grow the tent, and that is not doing that.
AP had a story today about the disparity in ad spend. The Harris campaign said, give us a break, guys. It's been 3 days. But Donald Trump is outspending, and Republicans outspending the Harris campaign and Democrats by 25-1. How quickly do they need to get up with ads on TV? We just showed a snippet of the video that went up this morning digitally. But how important is old-fashioned TV and radio? She's got the money to use.
Yeah, I think just as a reminder of how quickly this has all come together, I think the campaign is right where they want it to be, if not a little ahead of where you might expect, given how quickly we've gotten to this place. And so to have just after only a few days of kind of announcing kind of the official video already rolled out. And it seems that the vice president is already hitting the ground pretty hard, being in Houston earlier today before returning back here to the Capitol. I think they're right on track. They'll get there, and they're obviously raising the money and will have the funds to spend. And so, I think they're fine.
Yeah, well, on the money, Act Blue today said since Sunday, $200 million raised, more than that, from small dollar donors. That isn't the big fish. Yeah. That's the little guys.
Which would be a blowout.
Pretty remarkable.
Month or quarter, even for any other candidate at any other time. This is a remarkable moment that we're in.
It is indeed, and we're lucky to share moments like this with Brittany Martinez and Alvin Jordan, our wonderful political panel this evening. Thank you so much. And, of course, we're watching tomorrow. Benjamin Netanyahu making a trip down to see one of the candidates, Donald Trump, at Mar-a-Lago. We'll have full coverage of that, of course, in the Washington Edition newsletter, on the terminal, and online.
We'll meet you back here. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.